Good morning. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Acting Director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and I want to welcome you to today's Directors Forum with David Goldwyn, Special Envoy for International Energy Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Today's event is sponsored by the Wilson Center's European Studies Program, directed by Christian Osterman, and the Program on America and the Global Economy, directed by Kent Hughes. Dr. Osterman and Dr. Hughes are to be thanked for helping to put this event together, and Alex Peterson is to be thanked for his continued help to the initiative. European Studies Program launched a new European Energy Security Initiative which seeks to foster discussion and analysis on Eurasian energy issues of keen interest to scholars, policymakers, and industry representatives. Mr. Goldwyn has been in his current position in the State Department for about 17 months. I believe that included 23 trips involving 16 countries. Prior to this appointment by Secretary Clinton, Mr. Goldwyn was president of Goldwyn International Strategies, an international energy consulting firm from 2001 to 2009. Where he served as a leading advisor on extractive industry transparency. In addition to his extensive private sector experience, David Goldwyn served in the U.S. government in a variety of positions over a decade, from 1991 to 2001, ending in the position of Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs. He also served as chairman of the Global Energy and Environment Initiative at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and as a senior associate in the energy program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. David Goldwyn has authored a series of books and articles on energy issues. I will mention one that is very dear to us here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He co-authored with Jan Kalitzky a book and co-edited with Jan Kalitzky a book entitled Energy and Security Towards a New Foreign Policy Strategy. The book was co-published by our own Woodrow Wilson Center Press and Johns Hopkins University Press in 2005. David Goldwyn holds a BA in Government from Georgetown University, a Master in Public Affairs, Masters in Public Affairs from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, and a JD from New York University School of Law. It's my pleasure to welcome David Goldwyn to the Center, back to the Center. Good to have you. Great.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center for giving me this podium. The last time I was at this particular podium was in 2005 for the book release. As you said, I co-edited that book with my good friend Jan Kalitzky, and it was called Energy and Security Toward a New Foreign Policy Strategy. And essentially our thesis at the time was that the U.S. government needed to integrate how it treated energy and foreign policy. And that's because for other countries, energy security was very much a national security issue. And if we didn't, as a foreign policy matter, promote their security, then we were missing something important. What we were missing was their political vulnerability, their autonomy, and the ability to remove energy as something that would alter the path of their foreign policy in a way that was adverse to U.S. interests. And we had a second critique, which is that the United States also needed to change the way it treated energy, because energy was also a foreign policy vulnerability for us and had a disproportionate influence on how we treated other countries. And so we needed to integrate these two. And we had many steps that we saw as indispensable. It was 578 pages, and if Mike hadn't made us cut it down, it might have been a longer book. But the core tenets of the book were that first, the United States had to lead at home before it could lead abroad, because we had to have credibility. We couldn't just tell other countries what to do. That we had to make major investments in new technologies and in the space where private industry was not moving fast enough, but where we needed to. That we had to continue to diversify energy supply and energy suppliers, because oil and gas would remain and will remain strategic commodities for decades to come. That we needed to use natural gas as a bridge to a low-carbon future, and that we had to expand the collective energy security system to bring in China and India and other countries and multilateralize our energy security diplomacy. And thanks to Senator Lugar, in December 2007, the State Department was mandated to have an international energy coordinator who would report to the Secretary of State and be required to pay full-time attention to integrate those issues. So for me, it was a tremendous honor in 2009 when Secretary Clinton asked me to be her international energy coordinator and to serve as her special envoy. It's not very often that you write something and then you get the opportunity to practice what you preach. It's also really challenging. So that was a great privilege for me. And to be able to do this in an administration led by President Obama and people like Stephen Chu and John Holdren, who are such leaders in technology, to begin this energy security transformation has really been tremendous. Today I want to talk about what it means to actually integrate energy and foreign policy and how we in the administration and we in the State Department particularly are working to advance this energy security agenda. The administration's approach has 5 components. The first is promoting policies to increase the efficiency of energy use at home and abroad in order to change the slope of the demand curve, to reduce demand. The second is to work to diversify energy supply and energy suppliers. That's the number of countries who provide the United States or the global economy with energy, but also the kinds of energy that we use. Third, protecting energy markets. Fourth, expanding the collective energy security system. And fifth, making access to energy services a more central element of our foreign policy. So let me talk first about reducing demand. Under President Obama, we have in fact led at home before we lead abroad. The administration, as you know, both through the American Recovery Act and in other places, has increased fuel efficiency standards, not only for cars and light trucks, but across the fleet. We've increased investments in mass transit. We have raised building standards and appliance standards and are looking to do more in that space. We've made great support for mass transit. We've worked through the G20 to have other countries reduce inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, because if you can level the playing field, you can provide a more competitive environment for low-carbon throughputs. And we've launched major technology partnerships, and Secretary Chu has been the champion of this, with other consumers on electric vehicles, on energy efficiency, on carbon sequestration. So we have brought in other countries in a big way. And we are helping other countries develop low-emissions development strategies so that they can figure out how do they change their mix of energy in order to use less and make it go farther. So we've done a lot of work on reducing demand. That is primarily the Department of Energy. That's not a State Department job. The second thing we've been doing is working on diversifying supply. And I think this is a recognition that oil and gas for us, for countries in Eurasia, for countries in Africa, for emerging economies, remain strategic commodities. And for other countries, access to oil and gas is not just an economic issue. It's not a matter of whether it's too expensive or not. In some countries, it's a matter of whether the lights go on and the heat goes on in the winter. It's a matter of whether their economy can grow or not. So energy security for other countries is really about national power. It's access to the resources that countries need in order to maintain national power. And so it's a much bigger deal for them than it is for us, because we are very secure as a country, at least in terms of energy that we need for electricity. We worry about oil prices, but we don't worry about having enough. We don't worry about whether the pipelines are going to flow at all. We worry about the economic impacts. So that's something that we work at. And while we're working on diversifying supplies of oil and gas, we're also looking at diversifying other forms of energy supply. So that's why you've seen tremendous support for the promotion of renewable energy to both drive down the cost of wind and solar, but also to teach other countries how to integrate it into their grids. You've seen support for nuclear energy, which still remains with major challenges on proliferation and on waste disposal in this country, but you've seen strong support for trying to advance the nuclear energy agenda. But as a diplomatic matter, we have spent a lot of time engaging our major suppliers and emerging suppliers. So you've seen from the Southern Cone to the Persian Gulf to Eurasia, a conversation at the Secretary of State level, a conversation at the deputy level, and conversations that we have through our binational commissions to talk about the need for countries that are energy producers to maintain investment and keep a nascent economic recovery growing. And so we have that conversation with all of our major suppliers while we talk about their whole energy complex. Secretary Clinton has launched binational commissions, or we've heightened energy dialogues with Canada, Colombia, Angola, Nigeria, Mexico, and Russia. We have a U.S.-EU Energy Council where we talk about everything from markets and oil and gas supply to energy efficiency. Ambassador Morningstar, our ambassador for Eurasian energy diplomacy, works full-time on Eurasian energy security. But we're also engaging major consumers. The strategic dialogues that we have with China and India talk about the whole complex of energy issues. A lot of our conversation is about the markets, which is the fact that these countries get their energy security from the fact that we have liquid, open energy markets which they are able to access to get supply. And those markets are important to them, and so policies which support them and not undermine them are important for them as well as us. And I'm particularly proud of two programs that my office has launched which advance both the energy and the climate agenda. One is called the Energy Governance and Capacity Initiative, and the other is the Global Shale Gas Initiative. The Energy Governance and Capacity Initiative really grew out of a lot of work I did on oil sector transparency, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI. And what we did is we looked at a set of countries which have about 40 billion barrels in undiscovered oil and gas potential and saw that they were on the track to become energy producers. And we thought if we could leverage the expertise of the U.S. government in the Treasury Department, in the Bureau of Land Management, in the U.S. Geological Survey, in Commerce's Commercial Law Development Program, and teach these countries how to manage the money of energy production and how to manage the business before the revenues flow, then we would improve their ability to govern better. And their appetite for listening to that message is huge before the revenues flow in. It's harder to get the message across when oil production is already flowing and the revenues flow, because then they're dealing with the revenues and they're dealing with a lot of people who want to get access to them. So we launched this EGCI, and using our interagency partners, we're in 9 countries like Uganda and Sierra Leone and Liberia and Suriname and Guyana and Vietnam and Seychelles are on the horizon. And in a government-to-government dialogue, we are helping them govern better. This is good for the environment because we teach them how to do licensing that makes requirements on water quality before the production begins, and it also helps global energy security. The second initiative we have is something called the Global Shale Gas Initiative. Now, I think you're all familiar with how shale gas has revolutionized the global gas market and the U.S. gas market. There are huge amounts of supply available. The price of LNG has reduced. It's available on the spot market in Europe and other places. For a lot of countries that are now using coal as their primary source of energy, or dung, or wood, or charcoal, the ability to access natural gas with half the carbon of coal could be revolutionary for them in a number of ways. It could produce indigenous supply and give them a choice versus those countries where they only have one supplier. It gives them a low-cost economic choice versus coal if you can drive the cost low enough, because they get more efficiency and they're not looking at a huge price differential. And it's a bridge for them to move to more modern technologies. So we're dealing with 20 countries. We had them, I think, over 20 at the State Department this year. And what we teach them is introduction to governance. We teach them what you need to do to develop some unconventional gas safely. What kind of standards do you have in place? How do you do an environmental impact statement? How do you look at transmission from the place of production to the place where you're going to consume it? How do you price the gas so that it's economic for people to invest? How do you price it in the market so that you're able to generate electricity and have the electricity system function? And we're doing resource assessments in China and India, as you can imagine, in countries that are enormous energy consumers. If they are able to develop their own indigenous sources of gas at an economy-sized scale, then they have real choices versus coal, and this is good for climate, it's good for energy security, it's good for economic development. So we have gotten that off the ground, and I'm proud of the response and at the reaction that we've had from the countries. And it's another example of where we use this whole of government approach and use our colleagues at the U.S. Geological Survey, at FERC, at Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, at USAID, to teach countries how we do it, not to give them our model, but to say these are the things that you need to think about before you go forward. The third thing we do, the third pillar, is protecting markets. And I think people understand, or should understand, that open energy markets, which is the ability of oil and gas to flow to the purchaser, is really the core of our energy security. You can negotiate on price, but the fact that supply is no longer owned by countries as it was in the early 70s, that you have to go to a country to get supply, that it can move, when there's a hurricane in the U.S. and gas can flow to the U.S., or if there's a spike in demand of China and oil supply can move there, that's the core of our security. So we spend a lot of time making sure those markets are open and that investment markets are open, but also that they're fair. So you've seen the Commodities Future Trading Corporation, CFTC, if I got that right, doing a lot to open the transparency of trade and energy. We encourage other exchanges to be more transparent in the trade of energy. We fight manipulation in other markets when we see that. And we talk to other countries about why you don't want to lock up supply, why you want to have a liquid market. And we're working through the G20 to promote that system. The fourth pillar is expanding the collective energy security system. And in the book, we called for expanding the IEA and bringing more countries in. And it turns out that's a lot harder than it looks. But what we have done is work through the International Energy Agency and through other fora to try and bring China, India, Russia, Brazil, Thailand into the system. So the IEA has new partnership agreements where we talk to these countries about, particularly China, India, about the need to have strategic reserves, the need to use them for collective emergency response. It's a way that you can expose other countries which are growing their economies to these market mechanisms and rules in a way that's comfortable for them. But we also work on a hemispheric basis. The Energy Climate ECPA, the Energy Climate Partnership, yes, is a way that we have all flags in the hemisphere come together to work on energy and climate technologies. So the Brazilians lead in sustainable housing and the Mexicans lead on energy efficiency. And we can pool our resources, not with the U.S. telling everybody what to do, but having every country that leads in an area work together to try and propagate these technologies. The last thing that we're doing is an emerging agenda, and that's expanding access to energy in countries that are important to us. And two countries in particular, Haiti and Pakistan, are examples where the State Department, as a foreign policy matter, has engaged other governments in the need to transform their energy systems, particularly their electricity systems, both to increase access to people and also to provide more stability to the system. And so in Haiti, we've helped both through investment to try and rehabilitate the system, but also to engage the government on the need to get prices right, to get transmission working, to have a well-functioning operating system. And in Pakistan, where I had the honor of working with Ambassador Holbrooke, the Secretary Clinton launched a signature energy program which had the goal of trying to enable Pakistan to provide more reliable electricity. As you can imagine, summer in Pakistan without electricity, this is a big deal for the national economy. It's a big deal for national stability. And so we looked at investing in the whole system, from improving distribution to rehabilitating transmission to improving generation to helping farmers use tube wells in order to produce agricultural crops using less energy. And, it's sort of in the weeds, you would think, for something for the State Department to be investing in with USAID, but it's a national security issue for Pakistan. And so those are two examples of where we've started to use energy as a tool of foreign policy by expanding access to energy. I would say that we've started on a very good path, and we've started on this transformation. But there's a lot of unfinished business. Obviously, more steps we need to take at home to make sure that we meet the President's commitment of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 18%. And we have more to do in diversifying global supply. There are countries that are still vulnerable. The big uncovered space, in my view, is really access to electricity. You still have 1.5 billion people or more without access to reliable energy services. The number of people is likely to grow by 2050, even though there'll be more electricity provided. And it's a really sticky problem. Poor countries subsidize electricity because people are poor. Then nobody invests in generation because you can't recover the cost of generating electricity because people don't pay a cost recoverable rate. Then nobody invests in transmission and nobody invests in distribution. So what happens? Wealthy people burn fuel oil. Poor people burn charcoal, or they don't have electricity. The economy suffers as businesses can't generate a business on a reliable basis. But it's a really hard problem to fix because you have to persuade people higher energy prices will provide more reliability. that if you pay this, you'll actually get something. So you have a political message you've got to sell to countries, and you've got to persuade investors that if they build a plant, they will actually get paid. And it's something that countries have done successfully before. It's something USAID has taught countries to do with great success before. But as you see in places like Pakistan, or even here at home, it's a really hard challenge. But I think it's something that we need to do, because if you can get prices right in developing countries, then coal is no longer the favored fuel of choice because it's the cheapest. Then you have the ability to deliver more reliability. And I think you can combine political will and capacity building to help countries, but that's a space that I would hope that we would be in more. And the challenge of this electricity problem sort of leads me back to home. Because as we try and strike this balance between energy and environment in our own public debate, in our own Congress, in our legislation, I would encourage us to do so with a great deal of humility. Because the fact is, these are really hard and complex problems. How do you integrate renewable energy into an existing grid? And how does that impact price? How do you promote production or imports from your neighbors in a way where you can still lay claim to protecting the environment? How do you promote production but raise the bar on safety? How do you tolerate higher energy prices in some cases because it just internalizes the costs that you're not seeing, but reassure people that national economic recovery is not going to be challenged? And how do you promote cleaner energy even if it's not the cleanest energy? So I guess, for all policymakers in every administration, it's a balance, and it's trying to be struck by people of goodwill trying to do the right thing. And it's really destructive for people on either side of the extreme to politicize and polemicize the debate in a way that sort of maligns the intentions of the people that are trying to make change. I think what's certain is that the transformation of our energy system, transportation, electricity, and the world's energy systems is to a low carbon or a low emissions place is going to take a long time. What's also certain is that if we don't begin that transformation now, we're never going to get there, and that makes some hard choices. So as I finish my own term in government at the end of this week, I guess I'd urge all sides, Republicans, Democrats, environmentalists, energy producers, to keep an open mind and a patient ear and a civil tongue. And if we can do that, I think we can have a stronger economy, and we can have a cleaner environment, and we can have a safer world. And that, as the President say, is change that all of us can believe in. Thank you.
Yeah. David Goldwyn has said that he would take some questions. The floor is open. We have microphones on either side, and somebody will come to you to give it to you. Identify yourself and ask a brief question. Yes, the gentleman over there.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm an engineering and management consultant. How will newer technologies help in some of the objectives that you've outlined?
Thanks, Bob. Lots of ways. First of all, in the developing world, in many cases, renewable technology is the only available technology for people to access electricity. There are many places where the grid is not going to go, and today, renewable energy is the choice versus no energy at all. There are huge opportunities for wind, for solar, for run of the river, small hydro, as well as forms of distributed generation. So it's the top of the agenda for electricity. Second, new technologies, and I would consider new gas technologies as well as renewable and efficiency technologies, promotes the security agenda directly. I mean, right now, at the oil import bills are a huge part of developing country and even OECD economies. If you can reduce that bill through more advanced engines, through second-generation biofuels, through all kinds of alternative energy, you reduce their oil import bill and you help their economy. You diversify their supplies, particularly for gas-dependent or oil-dependent economies. They're able to sustain their own generation. They're less dependent on other countries, less vulnerable. And for all of the countries, particularly the emerging producers, which have huge environmental challenges and which internalize environmental costs because they also pay the health bills, then you give them a way to reduce their health costs, to improve their environment, and to do so in ways that, in terms of of kilowatts per unit of energy used, are more efficient and, in the long run, once you buy down the capital cost, cheaper.
The gentleman in the white sweater there, and then Clark, the next one here.
My name is Hong Ik-oh. I'm at SAIS Johns Hopkins University. My question is, East Asian countries such as China, India, Korea, Japan have been aggressively involved in overseas oil development. Does it affect U.S. foreign energy policy, or what is your evaluation of this phenomena?
Well, I think all the countries that you mentioned are significant oil consumers, and so from a market perspective, all countries that invest to meet their demand are doing a useful thing in terms of the global economy. So the fact that Japan or China or others invest in oil and gas is a good thing. I think where we tend to run into tensions, and where there are questions and where there are policy conversations between the United States and other countries, is how they operate in other countries. So if there are standards that we hope that other countries will apply, human rights standards, environmental standards, we hope that countries won't invest in countries like Iran, which are serious proliferation risks and which challenge international energy security. So it's not investing in oil per se, but it's where and how, where I think there are foreign policy challenges. But overall, everyone who pitches in to help meet demand by investing in supply is making a useful contribution.
Question here, and then here. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Van Dusen. Michael Nix, energy consultant here in town. Mr. Goldwyn, could you expand on the shale gas issue? I know here in the States I talk to folks that are throughout the energy community. You're looking at New York State. Albany is a bit more stringent with their regulations than, say, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or Charleston, West Virginia. What's been your experience and the regulatory environment that you're encountering overseas?
Well, I think other countries look at the United States and they look at the public acceptance of shale gas here, and they ask the questions. In fact, the point of our initiative was really to expose them to state and local regulators, as well as EPA and others, so they understand these challenges. As I see it, the first thing they have to understand is that you have to have safe practices for natural gas drilling, period. Most of the issues that have come up in the U.S., by my analysis, have had to do with inappropriate drilling practices rather than necessarily whether it's hydraulic fracturing or not. And there are states in the U.S., Pennsylvania is one, Texas is another, Colorado is a third, that have had decades of experience in regulating and monitoring natural gas drilling. There are states like New York where this is something brand new. And it's not that they have more stringent regulations, but it's different. And so the questions we tell other countries you have to think about are, one, do you have a regulator? Do you have rules? Can you inspect? Can you monitor? And then how do you think about public acceptance? In Texas, people might want a drill rig in their backyard and they're happy to do it. In New York State, they might not. That's a matter of public choice. And every state in the United States will decide for themselves whether they want it or they don't, because we have private landowners who own the land. Overseas, it's different, because in most countries, the resource and the land, the subsea resources, are owned by the government. So we caution governments, they've got to think about these public acceptance questions, and they also have to give people confidence that if they're going to do it, that they've got the rules in place so they can assure people about water quality. And this was really the eye-opener of our conference this summer, is people, I think, didn't know the web and sort of deep complex of regulations we have at the federal and state level with respect to safe drinking water. So when you start from the fact that you have safe drinking water regulated, and then you're just in the business of can you inspect and monitor and get it right, you're in a very different place than a country that may not have that regulation to begin with. And so that's part of the process, is get it right at the front end.
Alex. Yeah.
Alex Peterson with the center here. Well, this piggybacks very well on your question. If you're to accept the fact that I think we've had something of a shale gas or unconventional gas revolution in North America, can this revolution be replicated in Europe? where it could have potential significant geopolitical impacts regarding the relationship with Russia and other producers that the Europeans are trying to get to? Thanks.
Well, the answer is we'll see. The funny thing about shale as opposed to oil and traditional oil and gas exploration is you can, as a geologic matter, you can tell relatively quickly whether you have a shale formation, and they're well known. And Europe has very significant shale formations in many places. But you don't know until you actually begin exploration what the permeability of that is, whether it is gas prone or whether it's oil prone, whether it's whether it's shale gas or whether it's tight gas or whether it's something else. And so the process is very much on the front end. So from a geologic point of view, Europe has tremendous potential in many countries, in Poland, in Hungary, in Germany, in France, in many other countries. But whether it will actually come to pass will depend on whether there are fiscal regimes in place that will attract investment, whether there are regulatory regimes that will give reliability to investors that they can produce it, that they can sell it at a price that's worth the investment. And then you'll have to find out from the drilling whether or not what kind of gas it is and what the thermal maturity of this particular shale is and whether that's an economic resource. And then you'll have the public acceptance question about whether, even if you have it, whether people want it. And people will have to sort through that as well. So I think the short answer is we'll see.
This gentleman here. Yeah.
Thank you. David Lewis with Manchester Trade. On the Energy and Climate Partnership for the Americas, is there any next step with regards to closer integration of the LNG pillar and low emission, low carbon access to gas for countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and then the global shale gas initiative in terms of linking that up at the market level and the policy level?
Well, with respect to the shale gas initiative, there we'll do some work in the Southern Cone, Uruguay, and maybe Paraguay, because there are formations down there, and that was one of the outcomes of the ECPA ministerial last April. So that work will proceed. The initiatives are not really LNG or gas specific, but the things that we're looking at are electricity interconnection and integration, both in the Caribbean and in Central America. And so the way gas plays into that is if you can have electricity interconnection, the feedstock may be gas in Colombia if it can connect to Central America, or maybe there are possibilities for the Caribbean. We're investing in CPAC, which is the harmonization of Central America's electricity interconnection regulations. It's neutral with respect to feedstock, but it gets at the question of if you get gas someplace or something else where you have low emissions energy or lower emissions energy, then can you feed that into the system? The Caribbean is a unique problem because the markets are small and the countries are not connected, and the economics of integrating them is really difficult. So one of the outcomes of the last ECPA ministerial was we spent a day talking about electricity interconnection in the Caribbean, and the OES is undertaking a study to look at the technical or economic feasibility of partial interconnections. There are huge geothermal resources available in a number of the islands, but the question is, can you find a market big enough to connect the line and connect everybody else? And it's a hard problem. So we're looking at the problem of electricity rather than gas per se. But the fact that we are so rich in shale gas and that we are no longer going to be a huge LNG importer, and we have the potential, in fact, two permits have been granted by DOE already to export LNG, I think opens the possibility for gas supply to the hemisphere. But you've got Trinidad and Tobago that's got gas. You've got a number of places where gas is prone already. So the engineers will have to figure out whether it's the optimal feedstock for power.
The lady. Yeah.
Lauren Dickerson from the U.S. Energy Association. In the last couple of years, we've seen a tremendous amount of interest coming from developed and developing economies alike in nuclear energy. And I'm wondering what are the prospects for more engagement on the part of governments in nuclear affairs, especially coming from the U.S., which has a tremendous history and background in safety culture in the nuclear industry.
Well, we have a lot of conversation with a lot of countries about nuclear energy, and I think you've heard the President and Secretary Chu talk about the benefits of nuclear energy for low emissions power generation. The first conversation we tend to have with a country when they have an interest in welcoming a nuclear energy industry into their own country is how to make it safe. And so the State Department has an office that deals with the various safety regimes that a country needs to consider. The second conversation you have is a realistic one about what is the regulatory capacity that a country needs to put into place in order to operate and maintain and inspect a nuclear power industry. And that's a big challenge. So not every country is able to do it. So the conversations vary from conversations we have with China, where the Nuclear Energy Administration talks to them about high temperature cooling reactors and the most modern technologies, and conversations we have with Middle East countries about what the regimes are to subscribe to conversations we have with far less developed countries where they have to assess whether it's a realistic and cost-effective option. We're not really unified and integrated in how we talk about nuclear energy, but DOE has its Office of Nuclear Energy, its Policy of International Affairs, and then we have ours. But it's multiple conversations.
Peter, yeah. And
Peter Marsters with the China Environment Forum here at the center. My question is, how do you see access to sufficient fresh water supplies in countries where it may be a limit, for instance, China, as a potential strategic issue in energy development?
Water is a big issue, and in fact, it's a big part of our shale gas conversation. Is it uses a tremendous amount of water. If you're able to use non-potable groundwater, for that, that's terrific. You also worry about where you dispose of it, and so for a lot of countries, the water challenge is a bigger challenge than the energy challenge is, and so they may decide, at those flow rates, it's not something they want to do. But you also have, the amount of energy that it takes to produce and move water, and so. Undersecretary Maria Otero at the department has really led a water initiative. We're talking to other countries about water use, access to water, water rights. There is a great synergy between the two, and also, needless to say, with respect to whether hydropower is appropriate in a particular country, may have to do with what the river systems are, who shares the water. So it's a complicated issue, but it's definitely part of the conversation.
Gentleman, red scarf. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Hans Maul from the Transatlantic Academy. I feel a bit like watching Hamlet without the prince so far and listening to this very interesting presentation discussion. And the prince is the international price of energy in the future. Now, it seems to me that the international price of energy will be driven by the international oil market. And if you look at the price developments in the international oil market, in the past, prices have been very volatile and they have been very much affected by political factors. Now, is that the kind of price path for the future which will make it possible to have the kind of energy and climate policy transition which we are discussing here? And if not, what are your thoughts on possible alternatives to the price paths dictated by the international oil market?
Well, oil prices have been volatile, and we try and moderate those by sustaining investment and by having strategic reserves for shocks. But the linkage between gas prices and oil prices is eroding. And so it's no longer the case in every country that when the price of oil goes up, the price of gas needs to go up as significantly. Certainly in the United States, those prices are disconnected. And the core of that disconnection is the fact that we have such large indigenous production. And so, all the gas is not necessarily associated with oil, and we have different supply volumes. So there is the potential for gas prices to become more regionalized and less linked to oil, and we'll just have to see how that evolves in every country. Certainly, the glut of LNG and the opening of the spot market eroded that oil price link and led to reduced gas prices in Europe and even reductions in long-term contracts from Russia to European consumers because of the fact of that spot market, at the same time that oil prices were slowly ticking up. So I think one of the benefits of promoting gas development in these countries is to reduce the volatility in gas, and because it'll be less linked to oil, and have it more linked to local supply. The impacts of price, on sort of energy patterns, are varied, and as a policy, we don't comment on price. We don't have a particular price. High oil prices have led people to want to conserve more and buy more energy-efficient cars. But the fact is, they're going to have more energy-efficient cars to choose from now, regardless of the price of oil. The higher the price of gas goes up, or the price of coal goes up, if that's highly in demand, the more people look at other economic choices. So we can't really control it, but what we can do is promote the diversity of supply and the promotion of indigenous supply in the hopes that will reduce some of that volatility. There's also been the effort to make the markets more transparent. And I think when we saw the run-up to at least $140 for a day, some of, I would say even the majority of that price run-up came from fundamentals, and it came from long-term expectations. But you had a big move now embodied in legislation and used by other exchanges to provide more transparency, particularly in the over-the-counter market, so that you have less financial play in those areas driving volatility. And we'll see what happens, but the hope is also that smarter regulation and more transparent markets will reduce some of that volatility as well.
David, from the overflow room, a question. Short of a carbon price, reducing upstream and general subsidies for fossil fuels is considered to be the best way to encourage the development of renewables. What is the United States doing to reduce such subsidies?
Well, we made a commitment, the President made a commitment through the G20 and got the other G20 countries to agree to reduce inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So one of the things is the administration's budget proposed the elimination of a suite of tax expenditures which it classified as inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So we're doing that at home, and that will be battled out in the Congress. But that's how we do that, and those are both consumption subsidies that we look at, and also production subsidies. And we're trying to, through this G20 effort, talk to other countries, and it's a pretty rigorous process as these things go. I mean, every quarter, finance ministers are accountable for what they have done in their countries. The IEA has scored the countries on what they have done and how their fossil fuel subsidies have moved or not, and so and they hold themselves to account at the leaders' meeting every year. So it's a fairly rigorous effort, but in our country, as in every country, it'll be a political battle to see how much of that agenda you can complete.
Yeah. The gentleman in the second to last row at the corner, at the end. Yeah. No? That was a duplicate. It's a duplicate. Sorry. Okay. Over here, the lady in white.
Hi. Thanks. Lisa Friedman from ClimateWire. Just on the fossil fuel subsidies, I'm curious, what have countries done so far? But I'd like to ask you also about the energy poverty comments that you made earlier, and the difficulties in bringing energy access to the 1.56 billion people who don't have it. Could you pinpoint for us what some of the major challenges to alleviating energy poverty are? You seem to indicate that a large chunk of it was subsidies for fossil fuels, but I'm sure in different countries it's different things. And where are the encouraging spots? Is there a country that is doing something interesting or a widespread program? Where do you see encouragement in this area? Thanks.
Sure. On the first one, I probably couldn't give you the scorecard off the top of my head, but I don't know whether any of that stuff is on the web from the IEA. But essentially, it's a process of raising energy prices and reducing production credits in some countries. But it links to the second question you asked. The big challenge in most countries is the price of electricity. If the price of electricity is 3 cents a kilowatt, and the cost of coal is 7 cents and gas is 9 cents and renewable is 13 cents a kilowatt, then at that price, which is often improperly targeted, and by that I mean everybody in the country gets a subsidized price of electricity, then nobody wants to invest in generating electricity. And those who have money just buy fuel oil generators, and they import the fuel oil, and then they can serve themselves, and everyone else, suffers this cycle of despair. The challenge is then, how do you raise electricity prices in a place where people don't believe in the electricity system? So Nigeria is a great case in point. Nigeria flares enormous amounts of gas. Their nameplate electricity power generation capacity is something like 4 times what they actually produce. And that's because the price of electricity is subsidized for most of the country. So how is Nigeria going about trying to fix that? They put in a multi-year tariff order where now they're starting to raise prices over time. You raise the price to industrial consumers and maybe to government consumers, but you still subsidize the poor. And so you can begin to create confidence that if someone builds an independent power plant, that someone will actually pay the cost of the gas. If you can get that system right, you can reduce Nigeria's gas flaring. Right now there's no place to put the gas. You can't capture it unless somebody's going to buy it. So you get the price. Someone will build the capture. Someone will put that into electricity, and they will generate that electricity, and someone will pay the electric bill, and someone will buy the distribution company. So Nigeria is reforming that whole system right now. USAID has helped stand up independent power projects and has also helped them design the tariff orders and how to solve these problems. But it's a tough political problem to persuade people that your electricity prices are going up and you'll get electricity even though your prices are cheap now and you don't have electricity. But they're in Thailand, in Guatemala, in the Philippines, in Argentina, in a number of other countries, over a 10-year period. You introduce graduated increase in pricing. You have a public diplomacy campaign where you explain to people, or maybe you have a model sector where you're going to show people that the prices went up, but everybody there's got lights 24/7. And then you find out that people actually have more money than you would think. They're spending it on other things, or in other ways, or in lost productivity. But if your electricity prices go up a little bit, and you can run your business 8 hours a day, you'll be able to pay that cost. And it's been proven time and time again that even the poor can do this. I think in the 1990s there was a Village Power program the Department of Energy ran in concert with the World Bank, and they found out that there was adequate income even in the poorest of villages, and that prosperity rose once you provide them reliable electricity. But you have to do all the things. You have to give governments, you've got to show them how to raise those prices, how to set a tariff, how to introduce other kinds of energy in there. You've got to have a public diplomacy campaign. You've got to have the political will at the top to do it, and you have to have somebody, the bank, the United States, other countries, willing to step in and help them through that process, because it's really complicated. I mean, even sort of dispatch, whose electricity goes first? Is it the renewable guy? Is it gas? Is it coal? How do you not ruin the economics of your existing investors? It's really hard stuff. So if you can help governments do that, you can walk them through that. And so, I mean, Nigeria is making great steps. Pakistan was on the way. They've had some volatility in how they've implemented, but they raised electricity prices 46% over a year, and they just did a pause now, which it was their commitment to the IMF, and Secretary Clinton noted that was an unhelpful step backwards. But the fact is, they're moving in that direction, and so countries can do it, but it has to be a development priority for us, and it has to be a political priority for them, and it takes some patience. But I think but it can be done, and that's a case where, if you're looking at a developing country and you're standing up a system, everyone would want them to have renewable energy first. But if you're a poor country and you're going to pick up the cost for the poor, either through a lifeline tariff or something, and your first stage renewables are 13%, and your gas is 9 cents, and your coal is 5 or 7%, someone's going to pay that difference. And so what you need is a little patience to know that they're going to have a mix. And if you can raise prices, then you'll be able to introduce renewables into the grid, and you'll be able to have baseload power as well, and you'll improve the mix. But we can't all be purists about everything for every country, and that's some of the humility and patience that I was talking about earlier. But it's probably, for the next 20, 30 years, probably the most important development priority, political priority that we can have is access to electricity in the developing world.
From the other room, and then the lady in red in the back afterwards. With the recent momentum to improve relations between the United States and Russia, are there any efforts to engage Russia on energy broadly, or more specifically, gas supply security?
Ambassador Morningstar spends a great deal of his time talking to Russian, to European countries about exactly these issues. We have a bilateral dialogue, very high-level dialogue at the ministerial level with Russia, and so Ambassador Morningstar talks to them about global oil and gas supply, regional supply, and also electricity and other issues. I think it's a conversation where sometimes people listen more than they talk, and so I think Russia is in the process of assessing its own energy regime. And so we spend more time, I think, talking about energy efficiency and integration and progress in the new energy area than in the traditional energy area. But it's a conversation he has regularly, and that other parts of our government do as well.
In the back.
Thank you. Coral Davenport from National Journal. Hu Jintao is coming to Washington next week. Given the traditional tension between the U.S. and China over climate change, the current tension over some of the clean tech trade issues with subsidies, with rare earth minerals, export quotas, what should we expect to emerge from those conversations, both between the presidents and the second and third levels on energy and climate, and how will those tensions be part of this?
Coral, there you go, accentuating the negative instead of the positive. Actually, what we're going to talk about with President Hu when he comes to town is first a scorecard on all the initiatives that were launched on the president's trip to Beijing, and at the strategic and economic dialogue last May, on which we've made progress. Standing up a clean energy research center with China. We issued a joint statement on energy security with them, which both they and we are quite proud of, which is a commitment of what we have in common in terms of open investment, a respect for market principles, the need to promote efficiency. I think we'll talk about a lot of the progress and really remarkable investment that China is making on electric vehicles and alternative fuels, and its investments in solar energy and its own plans to raise efficiency. There is a remarkable amount of capital investment and technological change going on in China in this space, and it's something that we have in common. Some things that we can learn from them, some things they can learn from us, some things we can help propagate into other places. So I think that's going to be the core of the conversation. We have our traditional basket of issues that will be the subject of discussion at their leaders or ministerial level, but it's really the cooperation that we have going forward, which is going to be the core of the conversation. And on climate change, I think you've heard Todd Stern's report on the role that China played in Cancun, and so we're looking forward. Particularly on how to use the technology to promote greenhouse gas reduction. So I think it's going to be a terrific and very positive visit, and will be a launch pad for deepening our cooperation in those areas.
And one more question from out there, and then the lady on the aisle. How does the potential transfer of natural gas from, I guess, Leviathan, Israel, Greece, Europe, through an underwater pipeline potentially change the geostrategic equation in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, it is a remarkable thing, that there have been these really tremendous discoveries of gas potential in the Levant. Leviathan is I think the third largest gas find in the world in the last 10 years or something like that. What will happen to those resources remains to be seen. I think the choices have not been made by either the resource holders or the government of Israel about whether that's for the Israeli market or how it will be developed, whether it's for the Israeli market or for an export market, and if so, where. As you probably know, the question of gas pipelines is complicated. You need a purchaser on the other end, and then you've got to finance it. I think all those questions remain to be seen. But the fact is, as a geologic matter, this is a tremendous find, and that it highlights the possibility of gas finds farther up the coast. It may be there for Lebanon and for other countries, and for a region which is very short on gas and which is highly dependent on imports. This could be a major strategic change for all of them, both for climate in terms of where they get their feedstock, for independence and that they may have it domestically. And yes, there's certainly adequate resource to make a contribution to the European market as well. And I think that all depends on the economics, who's buying, for how much, and who finances a pipeline. So I think the potential is there, and I've certainly encouraged my colleagues who focus full time on Europe to take a good look at how the Levant can play a role.
The lady, on the aisle.
Marta Arpashevska from the National Wildlife Federation. The administration has made international emissions pledges under the Copenhagen Accord. And on the one hand, we've made progress on these pledges with the car and truck rules, energy efficiency measures. However, on the other, we're poised, or the administration is on track to approve the Keystone XL pipeline for the tar sands in Canada. How do you reconcile this?
Well, just to get the record straight, the administration the State Department, as the permitting agency, is now in the process of deliberating on the comments on the draft environmental impact statement that was produced last year, evaluating those comments, and then we'll make a decision about whether and when to issue that environmental impact statement. Whenever that statement gets produced, and there's a question about whether there would be a supplemental EIS or whether it would be the same EIS, yet to be determined by the two bureaus in the State Department that analyze those. Then there'll be a national interest determination about whether it's in the national interest of the United States to permit that pipeline, and all the agencies will have a chance to comment. So no decision has been made on that. In terms of how do you reconcile these things, that's one of the issues that I was alluding to earlier, which is that you have these hard choices. I think from an energy security point of view, you'll have to take into consideration in the process whether it's in the national interest of the United States to access large supplies from a neighboring non-OPEC country over the long term. You'll have to address the environmental question as well, which is how many more emissions will that produce? Are they being produced because there's a pipeline, or are they going to be produced anyway? And then probably the more relevant question, which is not whether there are emissions, because no matter where we get our oil, Nigeria or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or someplace else, there will be emissions, of some nature, as long as we continue to import oil from other countries, which seems like we will for a while. So then it raises two questions. One is, will we have the ability to meet our commitments, the President's commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to the levels that he has committed to, and will Canada undertake the national measures that it has committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by what will inevitably be the exact same percentage level that the United States does, because our economies are linked. So that's going to be a question of looking to governments. Will governments do what they say? And how are they going to do it? And those are all the questions that will go into the mix. But it's they're not simple questions.
One last question is allowed. Yes, the lady over here.
Elizabeth Pond, journalist in Berlin. I was wondering if you could comment on what the rate of electricity loss, or the rate of loss, is in transmission lines, and if this is a major focus that you have, and is the rate essentially the same in the United States, Europe, and China, say?
Rates of transmission loss vary dramatically from, some cases in the developing world where transmission losses are 90%. And that's largely having to do with, there's a polite word for theft of electricity. It's, it's sort of non-engineering losses or something like that, but non-technical losses. So that's a big issue in a lot of places. I think transmission losses, as a technical matter, have more to do with what physics will provide for the transmission of electricity and how far you're trying to wheel it. And so, a lot of what the work that Secretary Chu is leading on smart grid has to do with optimizing the distribution and the transmission of electricity in a way that reduces those losses. So, in the developed world, that's a technology question and a way of using computers to optimize the grid. In the developing world, it's part and parcel of this underpricing of electricity because people don't have an incentive to repair or police or inspect lines, and so they get accessed or broken or damaged, or people just kind of steal the electricity, and you don't have the economic wherewithal for people to try and reduce those losses, and so eventually the transmission lines just go into disrepair, and you don't have electricity. So big varied problem, lots of potential solutions. Here at home, we do pretty well.
Let's all thank David Goldwyn for his appearance here today, for his government service, and we wish him well. Thank you, David, for being with us.
Thanks so much.
Right.